The morning wind carried the smell of pine sap and dust across the valley, and the sound of wagon wheels grinding over gravel echoed long before the wagon itself came into view. Townsfolk gathered along the fence line the way they always did on delivery day, arms crossed, watching two young women kneel in the dirt to sort through a pile of broken lumber and bark scraps that the sawmill had no use for. Someone always laughed. Someone always did. The wood was warped, split, riddled with knots, the kind of refuse a sensible person burned for kindling and forgot. But the twins never burned it. They stacked it, sorted it, carried it piece by piece into the leaning gray barn behind their farmhouse. And they did this every single week without fail, rain or shine, while the men of the town shook their heads and murmured that grief did strange things to a person's mind. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed from the road, was that behind those splintered barn doors something was taking shape that would one day silence every last one of their doubts. Faith and Mercy Calloway had been born 11 minutes apart in a cabin at the edge of the Montana Territory, and in the 25 years since, they had rarely spent a night under separate roofs. They had the same chestnut hair, worn in braids that fell past their shoulders, the same steady brown eyes, the same quiet way of moving through a room as though they were listening for something the rest of the world had stopped hearing. Their mother used to say that God had made one soul and simply poured it into two bodies because he lacked the company. Their mother was not around to say such things anymore. Both parents had been taken by fever 2 winters past, within 4 days of each other, and the sisters had buried them side by side on the ridge overlooking the ranch, beneath the same crooked pine their father had always meant to cut down and never did. After the funerals, the neighbors had expected the girls to sell the land and move into town, or marry quickly, or at the very least hire a man to run the place for them. Instead, Faith and Mercy stayed. They mended fences themselves, learned to shoe the horses themselves, plowed what little land they could manage with a single aging mule named Buck, and slowly the town's sympathy curdled into something closer to bewilderment. 2 unmarried women running a ranch alone was strange enough, but it was the wood that truly convinced people something was wrong with the Calloway sisters. It had started almost by accident. Their father, before he passed, had been a fair hand at rough carpentry, mostly mending wagon beds and porch steps, and he had left behind a modest set of tools in the barn, a draw shave, a mallet, a few chisels dulled from years of use. Faith had picked one up on a whim one evening, not out of any grand ambition, but because the silence of the house after their parents died had grown unbearable, and her hands needed something to do besides fold laundry that no one else would ever wear again. She began working scraps of broken fence rail into small, simple things: a spoon, a comb, nothing worth mentioning. Mercy, who had always been the steadier of the two, the one who kept the household ledger and remembered which hen had stopped laying, watched her sister work by lamplight one night and said something that neither of them would forget. "You are not just whittling, Faith," she said. "You are talking to something. I can see it in your hands." Faith did not answer at first. She turned the little spoon over, feeling the grain beneath her thumb. "Maybe I am," she finally said. "Maybe it is easier to say things to wood than to say them to you." "You can say them to me too," Mercy said. "I know," Faith said, "but wood does not cry when I am sad. It just waits. That was the beginning, though neither sister recognized it as such. What began as a private way of grieving slowly became a habit, and the habit became something closer to devotion. When the sawmill on the North Road began hauling away its broken and unusable lumber, the twisted boards, the bark slabs, the offcuts too short or too knotted to sell, Faith asked the mill owner, a weathered man named Otis Pruitt, if she might have some of it instead of him burning the pile. Otis had squinted at her like she'd asked for the moon. "You want the trash wood?" "If you don't mind parting with it," Faith said. "Suit yourself," he said, shrugging. "Ain't good for nothing but a bonfire, anyhow." And so it began. Every week, the mill's delivery wagon rattled past the Callaway Ranch on its way into town. And every week, Otis's hired driver, a young man named Nathaniel Reyes, tossed a fresh pile of scrap wood off the back and onto the roadside near their gate. The townsfolk who happened to be passing through, heading to church or to the general store, would slow their own wagons and watch the twins kneel in the dirt, sorting through what looked, to any reasonable eye, like garbage. "Look at them," a woman named Opal Hendricks said one Sunday morning, not troubling to lower her voice. "Picking through rubbish like a pair of raccoons. It is a shame what happened to their folks, truly it is. But a person has got to wonder if it addled their minds some." Her husband, a heavy-set rancher named Lawless Hendricks, grunted in agreement. "Ain't natural. Two women out here alone with no husband between 'em, playing with broken lumber. Somebody ought to speak to them." Nobody did, of course. It was easier to talk about the Callaway sisters than to talk to them. And so the ritual continued, week after week, month after month, while the sisters carried their scraps into the barn, and the town watched from a comfortable distance and decided collectively that grief had simply broken something in the twins that could not be mended. Inside the barn, however, something very different was happening. The structure itself was old, built by their grandfather decades before, its boards silvered by weather, and its roof patched more times than anyone could count. But Faith and Mercy had claimed the back half of it as a workshop, clearing out the unused stalls, sweeping the dirt floor smooth, and hanging their father's tools on nails along the wall in careful rows. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the animals fed, the sisters would light a lantern and work. Faith's hands had grown surer with each passing month. What began as spoons and combs became small boxes with fitted lids, then simple stools, then chairs whose joints held tight without a single nail, using only the joinery methods she had taught herself through trial, error, and a battered old book on cabinetry that had belonged to their father. Mercy, for her part, discovered she had an eye for proportion and finish that Faith lacked. She sanded each piece until it was smooth as river stone, rubbed in linseed oil until the grain glowed warm in the lamplight, and began sketching designs in a notebook, ideas for pieces neither of them had yet attempted. A rocking chair, a cradle, though there was no child to fill it, a hutch with doors that swung true. "We could sell these," Mercy said one night, running her palm over the seat of a finished stool. "In town, at the mercantile maybe." Faith shook her head slowly. "Nobody in town would buy furniture from us, not after the way they look at us on delivery day." "Then somewhere else." "Where else is there?" Mercy did not have an answer for that. Not yet. The turning point, when it came, arrived quietly, the way most turning points do, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. Nathaniel Reyes, the mill driver who had been hauling scrap wood past their gate for the better part of a year, had grown curious about what became of it. He was a solitary young man himself, quiet by nature, the kind of person who noticed things others overlooked. One afternoon, instead of simply tossing the load and driving on, he lingered at the gate. "Miss Calloway," he called out to Faith, who was gathering an armful of split boards from the pile. "I hope you don't think me forward, but I have been hauling wood past this gate near on a year now, and I confess I have wondered what you do with it all." Faith straightened, brushing dust from her sleeve. She was not accustomed to strangers showing curiosity rather than judgment, and it took her a moment to find her voice. "We build with it," she said simply. "Build what?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the barn. "Would you like to see?" Nathaniel tied off his horses and followed her through the yard, and when Faith swung open the barn doors and stepped aside, she watched his face carefully, bracing for the same look of pity or amusement she had grown used to seeing on the faces of the townsfolk. Instead, Nathaniel went very still. The workshop held perhaps a dozen finished pieces by then, chairs and stools and small tables, a chest with dovetailed corners, a cradle Mercy had finished just that week, its rockers curved smooth and sure. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the barn's siding, catching the warm, honeyed color of the oiled wood, and for a long moment Nathaniel said nothing at all. "You made all this," he finally said, "from scrap." "From what your mill throws away," Mercy said, stepping in from the far stall, wiping sawdust from her hands. Nathaniel walked the length of the workshop slowly, running his fingers along the edge of a table, crouching to examine the joinery on a chair leg. "My uncle was a furniture maker back in St. Louis before he passed," he said. "I spent summers in his shop as a boy. I have seen fine work before, and I am telling you plainly, this is fine work. This is finer than most of what passes through the shops back east." "You are being kind," Faith said, though something in her chest had loosened at his words. "I am not a kind man by nature," Nathaniel said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a plain honesty that made both sisters believe him. "I am telling you the truth because I do not see the use in telling you otherwise. Does anyone else know about this?" "No one comes out here," Mercy said, "and no one in town would believe it if we told them." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering. "There is a man who comes through the territory sometimes, a photographer, goes from town to town making portraits and writing up pieces for the newspapers back east. Curiosities, unusual stories, that sort of thing. He was through the mill last month, talking to Otis about the timber business. If I sent word to him about this, would you let him see it?" Faith exchanged a glance with her sister. It was the kind of glance that needed no words, a whole conversation passing between them in the space of a breath, the way it always had since they were children. "We would," Mercy said. The photographer's name was Elias Whitfield, and no, that is not quite right, for that name has been set aside from this telling, so let it simply be said that the man who arrived at the Calloway Ranch 3 weeks later went by the name Jonah Marsh, a lean, sharp-eyed traveler with a wooden camera box strapped to the back of his wagon and an ink-stained notebook always within reach of his hand. He had made the trip on Nathaniel's recommendation, skeptical, expecting little more than a pleasant afternoon, and a wasted plate of photographic paper. What he found instead left him standing in the doorway of the barn for a full minute without speaking, much as Nathaniel had. "May I ask," he finally said, turning to the sisters, "who taught you this work?" "No one," Faith said. "Our father left tools behind. We taught ourselves." "From books?" "From one book," Mercy said, "and from trying and failing a great many times before we got it right." Jonah Marsh spent the better part of 2 days at the ranch, photographing the finished pieces, sketching the barn workshop, asking careful questions, and writing the sisters' answers into his notebook in a cramped, hurried hand. He photographed Faith at her workbench, a chisel in hand, sunlight catching the sawdust drifting in the air around her. He photographed Mercy applying oil to the arm of a rocking chair, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. And on the second evening, as the sisters made him a supper of beans and cornbread at their kitchen table, he told them something that neither of them quite believed at the time. "I intend to write about this," he said. "Not as a curiosity piece, though I will not pretend some readers will see it that way at first. I intend to write about it because it is honest work, made honestly, by 2 women the world decided to overlook. I think that story matters more than most of what I have written in 10 years of this trade." "Nobody will care what 2 ranch women in the middle of nowhere are doing with scrap lumber," Faith said, not unkindly, simply stating what experience had taught her. Jonah smiled faintly. "You would be surprised, Miss Calloway, how many people are tired of hearing about things that are easy. People remember the ones that were hard." The article ran 6 weeks later in a regional paper out of Helena, and from there copies and reprints found their way east, as such things sometimes did, carried by traveling merchants and passed hand to hand until word of the Calloway sisters' barn workshop had traveled farther than either woman could have imagined. Letters began arriving at the small post office in town, addressed simply to Faith and Mercy Calloway, furniture makers. Some from as far as Chicago, inquiring about commissions, asking whether pieces could be shipped, whether prices could be quoted. The town, predictably, did not believe it at first. "Newspaper nonsense," Wallace Hendricks scoffed at the mercantile counter, waving a hand as though swatting away a fly. "Some fool writer needed a story and made those 2 into something they ain't." But the letters kept coming, and then, on a bright autumn morning that neither sister would ever forget, a well-dressed man stepped down from the stagecoach in town, inquired at the general store for directions to the Calloway Ranch, and introduced himself an hour later at their gate as a buyer representing a furniture concern out of Denver. "I read the article," he said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking somewhat out of place among the chickens and the mule. "I did not entirely believe it. I confess I came expecting to be disappointed." Faith led him to the barn without a word, and Mercy watched from the doorway as the man's expression shifted from polite skepticism to something close to wonder as he moved among the finished pieces, lifting chairs to examine their undersides, running his thumb along dovetail joints, holding a small carved box up to the light. "I would like to place an order," he finally said, "for as many pieces as you can produce in the coming year, and I would like to discuss a standing arrangement beyond that, if you are amenable." The numbers he quoted, when he finally spoke them plainly at the kitchen table over cups of coffee, were larger than anything the sisters had handled since their parents' passing. Larger, in truth, than anything the ranch had earned in a good year of cattle and crops combined. Mercy's hand trembled slightly as she wrote the figures into the household ledger that night, not from fear, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a door swinging open where she had long ago stopped expecting one to exist. Word spread through town the way word always did, faster than truth could keep pace with it, and within days the same neighbors who had slowed their wagons to laugh now slowed them to stare in a very different way. Opal Hendricks, who had once called the sisters raccoons picking through rubbish, appeared at their gate one afternoon with a basket of preserves and an expression that struggled visibly between pride and embarrassment. "I only wanted to say," Opal said, standing stiffly at the fence, "that I read the piece in the paper. It was very well written, about you both." "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks," Mercy said, taking the basket with more grace than the moment probably deserved. "I suppose," Opal continued, and here she faltered, glancing down at her hands, "I suppose I ought to say I was wrong about you, both of you. I said unkind things, and I said them where you could hear, and I am not proud of it now." It was Faith who answered, stepping up beside her sister. "We never held it against you, Mrs. Hendricks. Grief does not always look the way people expect it to. We understood that folks did not know what to make of us." "Well," Opal said, clearing her throat, clearly relieved to be forgiven so easily, "I hope you know the whole town is talking about you now, and not the way they used to." The months that followed carried the sisters through a season of change so rapid it sometimes left them breathless. The barn workshop, once a quiet refuge for two grieving women, was expanded that winter, its walls reinforced, new windows cut into the siding to let in more light, a proper stove installed so they could work through the coldest months without their hands going numb. Nathaniel Reyes, who had first noticed their work and set the whole chain of events in motion, began coming by more often than his mill deliveries strictly required, and by spring he had taken to spending his evenings in the workshop as well, learning the trade himself, his uncle's old lessons finally finding a place to root. Faith found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she admitted even to Mercy, though her sister's knowing smiles suggested she had noticed anyway. The sisters began to specialize as their reputation grew, Faith focusing her skill on structural pieces, chairs and tables and cradles, while Mercy's gift for finishing and design led her toward smaller decorative work, boxes and frames, and the delicate inlay work she had taught herself from careful study of pieces sent to them as reference by their Denver buyer. Together they built what the newspapers had started calling, with more affection than accuracy, the Callaway Collection, a name that stuck despite neither sister ever choosing it themselves. By the following autumn, a full turn of the seasons since Jonah Marsh had first stood speechless in their barn doorway, the Callaway Ranch looked very different than it had. The barn bore a new sign above its doors, simple lettering burned into a plank of the very scrap wood that had started it all, reading Callaway Workshop. A second, smaller structure had been raised nearby to house the growing stock of raw lumber, no longer scraps and offcuts alone, for Otis Pruitt at the mill had taken to setting aside his finest cuts for the sisters as well, a gesture he made without ever quite admitting that he, too, had once doubted them. The mule, Buck, had been joined by a second horse, purchased outright with the workshop's earnings, and the fences that had sagged since their father's passing stood straight and mended. It was on a cool morning in that second autumn, almost exactly 2 years to the day since they had buried their parents on the ridge above the house, that Faith and Mercy climbed the familiar path together, as they did every year on that date, carrying between them a small cedar box they had built themselves, its lid inlaid with a pattern of interlocking rings that Mercy had designed the previous winter. They knelt together at the 2 modest headstones beneath the crooked pine, and for a while neither of them spoke. The valley stretched out below them, gold and amber in the early light, the ranch house and the barn and the workshop all visible from the ridge, smoke curling from the chimney where breakfast was being kept warm. "We did not fall apart," Mercy finally said, setting the cedar box gently between the 2 graves. "I was afraid we would. That first winter, I was afraid every single day." "I was afraid too," Faith admitted. "I did not know what to do with my hands or my heart, and the wood was the only thing that seemed to listen." "Do you think they would be proud?" Mercy asked, though the question was less for her sister than for the quiet air around them. Faith reached over and took her twin's hand, the way she had taken it 11 minutes after they were born, the way she had taken it at every funeral, every hard winter, every uncertain morning since. "I think they always knew what we were capable of," she said. "I think we were the last 2 to figure it out." They sat together a while longer as the sun climbed higher over the ridge, and then they rose, brushed the dust from their skirts, and walked back down together toward the barn where the day's work waited. The same barn that had once held nothing but broken lumber and the quiet grief of 2 young women learning how to keep living. It held something else now. It held proof that what the world calls waste is very often simply something nobody has taken the time to understand. That patience and grief and love, given enough time and enough steady hands, can build something no one thought possible, and that the people who laugh the loudest at what they do not understand are very often the same people who will one day stand in the doorway, hat in hand, humbled by what they see. If this story moved you even a little, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave a comment and let us know what part of Faith and Mercy's journey touched you most. And if you want more stories like this one, be sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with us, and may you always find the strength to build something beautiful out of whatever life leaves at your gate. We will see you in the next story.